guys, it's Kanika. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about retroactively diagnosing criminals and celebrities. Again, I'm not a medical professional and these are not actual diagnoses. Please make sure you like and subscribe because that would help me out an awful lot. So a lot of the time we get told that certain criminals and actors and people in the public world are sociopaths or narcissists or borderlines. This is kind of used to explain away their behavior, which is really inaccurate and kind of stupid. So let's get into this now. Let's talk about Ted Bundy. Obviously, people would say that he is a psychopath, that he is narcissistic, vain, shallow, and so he features all of the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality. Now, I did a lot of research. I've been researching Ted Bundy since 2012, so I have read basically everything that's ever been written about him, his letters, listened to interviews, hours and hours of interviews, because that guy, he loved to talk to anyone who would listen. So one interesting book that I read was by Dorothy Otnell Lewis. She was Ted Bundy's psychiatrist, evaluating him to see whether he was fit for trial. Her diagnosis was that Ted was a bipolar person, so he had manic depression, as was written back in the 70s. This is kind of an antithesis to what other diagnosticians have said about Ted. He's glib, he's superficial, he's got a lot of charm, he's very, very flaky. He doesn't have any empathy, remorse, or guilt. So everyone has kind of labeled him a sociopath. And from his behavior, it can be quite safely assumed that yes, he did have antisocial personality. He was also tested by Hervey Cleckley. Him and Robert Hare created the psychopathic checklist, a survey of about 40 questions that should be done by a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but is often done by people on the internet. Basically, on that test, Ted did score 39 out of 40. To put this into perspective, normal people will fall 20 and under, and 20 is really pushing it. When I was evaluated with this, I was given 38. Don't really think it's super accurate, but it's been multiple psychiatrists, so I'm just gonna own it at this point. Ted has been diagnosed multiple times, but the fact that he was bipolar wasn't really mentioned by anyone other than Dorothy Lewis and Ted himself, because Ted would often talk about manic depression. Like, he'd have these manic phases where he would go out, he would spend a lot of money, he would go out on his murder sprees, he would do all of these reckless, impulsive things that normally he wouldn't do. He talked about being a chatterbox, that he would sleep only 3 or 4 hours a night, that sort of stuff, which is really not indicative of a personality disorder. It was clearly a mood disorder that he was suffering from. But it's really easy to just say, well, he murdered a lot of people, so he must be a psychopath. A lot of killers are psychopaths, but for a lot of them that's also not really accurate at all. And so yeah, with Ted, with his depressive phases, he said he wouldn't be able to get out of bed, that he had no sort of energy to him, he couldn't plan out anything, he didn't want to go to university. It was big things like that. I get this on my channel a lot. I get a lot of comments saying people with antisocial don't get depression, and this is proof that absolutely they do, and to an extent that it's unbelievable to the neurotypical, because underneath sadness you have a personality and you have something to fill you in, fill you up. The fact is that we don't. So when we crash hard, and that was always the case with Ted Bundy. His antisocial personality was comorbid with his bipolar disorder. I'm not making that diagnosis. I just think that people need to understand that just because he committed violent acts doesn't mean it's because he was a psychopath. He also had dark thoughts that controlled what he did and what he didn't do, which is an active choice that he made. Here's a killer that you probably haven't heard of unless you're very well versed in killers and true crime. Her name is Katherine Knight. So she's an Australian woman, the only woman in the history of New South Wales to get life without parole in prison. This is because her crime was so vile that they couldn't put it in the newspaper on a Sunday because it would make people sick. She murdered her partner. She chopped him up into little pieces. She made a skin suit out of his skin and hung it up from a meat hook. And then she put his head in the pot on the stove, cooked his flesh, and tried to feed it to his children. During this, she also went to withdraw $1,000 out of his account from an hour away ATM. Then she came home, took some sleeping pills, and claimed that she had no idea what happened. Now, from hearing that, the first thing you're gonna think is psychopath. But you're wrong. She is not a psychopath, and she has been clinically diagnosed otherwise. Not only was she cleared of any thoughts of ASPD, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. You can see this in a pattern of her behavior. So she would have extreme emotional highs and lows, not the type that's seen in bipolar. So in the case of Ted, where he has 2 weeks of depression and then 2 weeks of a manic state, Catherine Knight would rapidly cycle throughout the day. So she'd be in love with John Price in the morning, and at night she would plot his murder. So what she did was very much fueled by emotion, and obviously the first thing anyone thinks when they think of her crimes is sociopath or psychopath. It shows us that people are not at all informed about the disorder, and that not all bad behavior can be blamed on antisocial personality, because Catherine had none of that. She did have problems growing up with physical fights, and prior to her relationship with John Price, she had 3 other partners who she beat, had kids with them, put one of the kids on the train track, threatened them with knives. She beat one over the head with a clothing iron. He was only late from the pub by 10 minutes. So she beat the crap out of him and he was unconscious, and he tried to flee to Queensland. If you actually go through and listen to her behaviour, there is no way an educated person would venture ASPD. You would think 100% borderline personality. And that's the problem, like when you're just armchair diagnosing, you're not taking into account the factors that go into a crime, the factors that go into diagnosing somebody. I'm also not a doctor, so while I have a lot of experience in the field from my own research, I can't make these assertions as to whether someone should be diagnosed with one particular cluster B personality. So to continue with Catherine, she had a very labile sense of mood. She would form attachments with people. She'd use sex as a tool, as a weapon even. When guys were asked why they stayed with her, it was because of their sex life, which was apparently wild. That made up for, throwing your baby on the train tracks. Yeah, so I think it's really quite silly for people to be making these claims without knowing anything. I don't know if I should be revealing this to YouTube, but my psychiatrist, who I saw probably about 2 years ago, he's a forensic psychiatrist, and he was the clinician who evaluated her. And he said that she was a wonderful person to meet with. She's very charismatic and she's bubbly, and she would never speak about her crimes. But she has a pervasive history of harming herself for attention, harming other people for attention, dressing provocatively, doing these sorts of things. And while a sociopath may do that, they most often will not. Their harm is not inwards, whereas borderline narcissists and histrionics often do self-harm.